So, today I want to talk about inflation and price gouging. No matter where you are, you've likely seen the price of nearly everything increase within the past 2 years. Whether it's food, rent, medicine, utilities, gas prices, or any other purchases or basic necessities that you've needed to acquire, everything seems to just be more expensive. In the meantime, wages have remained relatively stagnant as businesses have refused to raise the amount that they've paid employees, all the while complaining that there's a worker shortage. That said, while supply chain issues tied to the COVID pandemic have certainly been a factor in the increase in prices, it's actually price gouging done by corporations that actually seems to be the greatest factor in the increase of prices. In fact, companies are openly admitting that this is actively what they're doing. We have here an article from the New York Times where we can see this quite plainly. As Hostess's CEO told shareholders last quarter, when all prices go up, it helps. The head of research for the bank Barclays echoed this. The longer inflation lasts and the more widespread it is, the more air cover it gives to companies to raise prices. More than half of retailers admitted as much when surveyed. So this is what we're dealing with when we talk about the fact that these companies are price gouging. They're actively admitting that they are using inflation, that they are using the higher prices of certain items as an excuse to raise their prices even more. We even have here that executives on their earnings calls crowed to investors about their blockbuster quarterly profits. One credited his company's successful pricing strategies. Another patted his team on the back for a marvelous job in driving price. These executives weren't just passing along their rising costs, they were going for more. Or as one CFO put it, they were not leaving any pricing on the table. And even the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, said that sometimes businesses are raising prices just because they can. And so what we're seeing here is that a lot of these companies are making record-breaking profits, more than they ever did before. Not only are they passing the cost of inflation entirely onto consumers when they were already making record-breaking profits, they are now increasing beyond that and making even more money, and they're using inflation as the justification for doing it. The issue here is that the private sector has no checks on these increases in prices. Now, we can find out here that the pre-tax profits for most companies have actually been better since any year since the 1950s. Pre-tax profits soared about 25% from 2020, far outpacing the increase in consumer prices. Now, whenever you see this disparity between consumer prices and how much these companies are making, you have to recognize that they're skimming off of the top from people. People at the bottom rungs of society are often the ones who are having the little bit of wealth that they have, the little bit of money that they have, taken from them in order to pad these corporate profits. There's nowhere else for this money to come from. The report highlights an ongoing debate about the causes of inflation, with some consumer advocates arguing that corporations are using inflation as a justification for passing on even higher prices to consumers. The fact is, we don't have to imagine that, as this article said. They're flat out admitting it. They know what's going on. And Robert Reich, the former Secretary of Labor of the United States, has called this out as well. Meat price increased by double digits. Tyson's CEO says they're asking customers to pay for inflation. Meanwhile, Tyson posted $1 billion in profits last quarter, a 48% increase from the first quarter of 2021. Don't be fooled. This is about corporate greed. It always is. This is absurd. Because again, the companies could be eating some of the costs of inflation. They could actively choose to do what is right and make sure people can afford to pay for food during a time of crisis like what the COVID pandemic had caused. Instead, they're passing these costs on and then price gouging even further. Companies have used some of that profit to boost CEO compensation and give lofty benefits to shareholders like increased dividends or stock buybacks, meaning the rich are getting richer, the CEOs are making more money, the shareholders are buying up more of the stock and are making more money or future dividends. In many corporate leaders have also boasted to investors of their ability to pass along price increases to consumers. They're just digging it in because they don't care. When corporate profits are at their highest levels in nearly 50 years and companies are showering their shareholders with billions in new benefits over the last year, it raises serious questions whether industries like retail have had to hike prices on families to such excessive degrees. So, what's really going on here? And I've kind of touched on some of this, but a lot of these companies are trying to raise these prices to the point where they're maximizing the amount they can earn while still allowing people just enough to survive and get to the point where people are on the verge of revolt, but not quite reaching it. And that's what they want because they're just ready to extract all the wealth from people. You know, when you look at some more of the data of which industries and companies have grown during this time, medium company has seen 49% profit growth, according to The Guardian. Steel industries gained 809%. Certain food grocery places, 671, Amazon 333% rise, Chevron as an oil commodity, 144%, Dr. Pepper has 83% increase, Hershey 62% increase, and these are on large scale profits. Meanwhile, workers have gotten 1.6% increases. That is ridiculously low. And when these companies are talking about, oh, well, we couldn't possibly raise wages because that'll cause inflation. Well, what exactly is happening when they're making these record-breaking profits instead of sharing any of it with workers? They know flat out what they're doing, and they know exactly how much they're taking from people. When the questions asked from The Guardian, profits or profiteering, The Guardian's findings are in line with recent U.S. Commerce Department data that shows corporate profits rose 35% during the last year and are at their highest level since 1950. Inflation, meanwhile, rose to 8.5% a year over the year in March. So what's the difference between that 35% and 8.5%? Again, it's coming from people. They are literally taking more money from people than they were in previous years. And it is regular people who are right now unable to pay their rent, who are unable to pay for food, who are unable to pay for medicine, the average worker who is suffering the most. So it really does need to be understood that when we see these record-breaking profits, it will always mean that corporations are extracting wealth from people. If prices are rising, wages are not, and corporations are collectively making more money, there's just nowhere else for that money to come from than regular people trying to survive. And some of the companies like Home Depot have tried to make these arguments like, oh, well, there was just an increase in the desire for, people to buy home-based products. Meanwhile, they're showing 38% increases in their profits. And the fact remains that it's not coming from another industry. So again, where is it coming from? It's coming from regular people. It's coming from other places. It's not coming from nowhere. As we are seeing in all of this, corporate greed is extracting wealth and resources from people who are barely making rent, struggling to pay for food, medicine, and other basic necessities of life. The fact remains, however, that this is how the market functions, and this is important to keep in mind. As shocked and appalled as many people may be hearing this information, price gouging is actually the economic, desire and goal. And it's a good way for these companies to fulfill exactly what they're designed for. This is the incentive provided under capitalism. Their goal is to extract as much wealth. It is to make as much money as possible. So the goal under this economic system being to maximize profit, we must acknowledge that they're doing exactly what's intended. This is a feature, not a bug. Far from being a great allocator of resources during scarcity, the market consistently creates conditions where corporations benefit from scarcity and inflation at the cost of human lives and livelihoods. As we demonstrated, when there's an excuse to raise prices like inflation, or there's scarcity involved in any way, shape, or form, these companies can constantly increase their prices without any negative repercussions. There's no reason for them not to. And no matter how much government may step in to try to regulate the market, this will repeat itself, and history has shown this to be true. Because eventually they'll buy out the government, and eventually they'll take everything back, just as we've seen before. We have to try something different because capitalism cannot solve these crises. If an economic system's goal is to make profit, we shouldn't be surprised when entities go out of their way to accomplish their goal. If you want to fix this, we need a resource distribution system based on community and human needs first. And that means we're going to have to develop some form of socialism or communism. There is no alternative. So with that said, if you've enjoyed what you've watched, consider liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment, as well as joining my Discord, where we have conversations on topics like these. If you're in a financial place to do so, and only if you're in a financial place to do so, please also consider supporting me on Patreon, especially as political content like this can often be demonetized on YouTube. The links for everything that I've mentioned are in the description down below. And with that said, my name is Anarchist Tara. Thank you for watching.